On reaching his distant sleeping place, the philosopher could not for a long time get to sleep, but weariness gained the upper hand at last, and he slept on till it was time for dinner. When he woke up, all the events of the night seemed to him to have happened in a dream. To keep up his strength, he was given a mug of vodka. Over dinner, he soon grew lively, made a remark or two, and devoured a rather large sucking pig almost unaided. But some feeling he could not have explained made him unable to bring himself to speak of his adventures in the church, and to the inquiries of the inquisitive he replied, "Yes, all sorts of strange things happened." The philosopher was one of those people who, if they are well fed, are moved to extraordinary benevolence. Lying down with his pipe in his teeth, he watched them all with a sweet look in his eyes and kept spitting to one side. After dinner, the philosopher was in excellent spirits. He went around the whole village and made friends with almost everybody. He was kicked out of 2 huts. Indeed, one good-looking young woman caught him a good smack on the back with a spade when he took it into his head to feel her chemise and skirt and inquire what stuff they were made of. But as evening approached, the philosopher grew more pensive. An hour before supper, almost all the servants gathered together to play Cragley, a sort of skittles in which long sticks are used instead of balls, and the winner has the right to ride on the loser's back. This game became very entertaining for the spectators. Often the coachman, a man as broad as a pancake, was mounted on the swineherd, a feeble little man who was nothing but wrinkles. Another time it was the coachman who had to bow his back, and Desroches, leaping on it, always said, "What a fine bull!" The more dignified of the company sat in the kitchen doorway. They looked on very gravely, smoking their pipes, even when the young people roared with laughter at some witty remark from the coachman or spirit. Koma tried in vain to give himself up to this game. Some gloomy thought stuck in his head like a nail. At supper, in spite of his efforts to be merry, terror grew within him as the darkness spread over the sky. "Come, it's time to start, Mr. Seminarist," said his friend, the gray-headed Cossack, getting up from the table with Desroches. "Let us go to our task." Koma was taken to the church again in the same way. Again he was left there alone, and the door was locked upon him. As soon as he was alone, fear began to take possession of him again. Again he saw the dark icons, the gleaming frames, and the familiar black coffin standing in menacing stillness and immobility in the middle of the church. "Well," he said to himself, "now there's nothing amazing to me in this marvel. It was only alarming the first time. Yes, it was only rather alarming the first time, and even then it wasn't so alarming. Now it's not alarming at all." He made haste to take his stand at the lectern, drew a circle around him, pronounced some exorcisms, and began reading aloud, resolving not to raise his eyes from the book and not to pay attention to anything. He had been reading for about an hour and was beginning to cough and feel rather tired. He took his horn out of his pocket and, before putting the snuff to his nose, stole a timid look at the coffin. His heart turned cold. The corpse was already standing before him on the very edge of the circle, and her dead greenish eyes were fixed upon him. The philosopher shuddered, and a cold chill ran through his veins. Dropping his eyes to the book, he began reading the prayers and exorcisms more loudly, and heard the corpse again grinding her teeth and waving her arms, trying to catch him. But with a sidelong glance out of one eye, he saw that the corpse was feeling for him where he was not standing, and that she evidently could not see him. He heard a hollow mutter, and she began pronouncing terrible words with her dead lips. They gurgled hoarsely like the bubbling of boiling pitch. He could not have said what they meant, but there was something fearful in them. The philosopher understood with horror that she was making an incantation. A wind blew through the church at her words, and there was a sound as of multitudes of flying wings. He heard the beating of wings on the panes of the church windows and on the iron window frames, the dull scratching of claws upon the iron, and numberless evil creatures thundering on the doors and trying to break in. His heart was throbbing violently all this time. Closing his eyes, he kept reading prayers and exorcisms. At last there was a sudden shrill sound in the distance. It was a distant cock crowing. The philosopher, utterly spent, stopped and took a breath. When they came in to fetch him, they found him more dead than alive. He was leaning with his back against the wall, while, with his eyes almost popping out of his head, he stared at the Cossacks as they came in. They could scarcely get him along and had to support him all the way back. On reaching the courtyard, he pulled himself together and bade them give him a mug of vodka. When he had drunk it, he stroked down the hair on his head and said, "There are lots of foul things of all sorts in the world, and the fright they give one, there." With that, the philosopher waved his hand in despair. The company sitting around him bowed their heads, hearing such sayings. Even a small boy, whom everybody in the servants' quarters felt himself entitled to depute in his place when it was a question of cleaning the stables or fetching water. Even this poor youngster stared open-mouthed at the philosopher. At that moment, the old cook's assistant, a peasant woman not yet past middle age, a terrible coquette who always found something to pin to her cap, a bit of ribbon, a carnation, or a little paper if she had nothing better, passed by in a tightly tied apron which displayed her round, sturdy figure. "Good day, Koma," she said, seeing the philosopher. Aye, what's the matter with you?" she shrieked, clasping her hands. "Why, what is it, silly woman?" "Oh, my goodness, why, you've become quite gray." "Aha, why, she's right," Spirid pronounced, looking attentively at the philosopher. "Why, you have really become as gray as our old Yevtuk." The philosopher, hearing this, ran headlong to the kitchen, where he had noticed on the wall a fly-spattered triangular bit of mirror before which were stuck forget-me-nots, periwinkles, and even wreaths of marigolds, testifying to its importance for the toilet of the finery-loving coquette. With horror, he saw the truth of their words. Half of his hair had in fact turned white. Koma Brute hung his head and abandoned himself to reflection. "I will go to the master," he said at last. "I'll tell him all about it and explain that I cannot go on reading. Let him send me back to Kiev straight away." With these thoughts in his mind, he bent his steps toward the porch of the house. The captain was sitting almost motionless in his parlor. The same hopeless grief which the philosopher had seen in his face before was still apparent. Only his cheeks were more sunken. It was evident that he had taken very little food, or perhaps had not eaten at all. The extraordinary pallor of his face gave it a look of stony immobility. "Good day," he pronounced on seeing Koma, who stood cap in hand at the door. "Well, how goes it with you? All satisfactory?" "It's satisfactory, all right. Such devilish doings that one can but pick up one's cap and take to one's heels." "How's that?" "Why, your daughter, your honor. Looking at it reasonably, she is, to be sure, of noble birth. Nobody's going to deny it. Only, if I may, God rest her soul." "What of my daughter?" "She had dealings with Satan. She gives one such horrors that there's no reading scripture at all." Read away. She did well to send for you. She took much care, poor darling, about her soul and tried to drive away all evil thoughts with prayers." "That's your right to say, your honor, but I swear I cannot go on with it." "Read away," the captain persisted in the same persuasive voice. "You have only one night left. You will do a Christian deed, and I will reward you." "But whatever rewards, do as you please, your honor, but I will not read," Koma declared resolutely. "Listen, philosopher," said the captain, and his voice grew firm and menacing. "I don't like these pranks. You can behave like that in your seminary, but with me, it is different. When I flog, it's not the same as your rector's flogging. Do you know what good leather whips are like?" "I should think I do," said the philosopher, dropping his voice. "Everybody knows what leather whips are like. In a large dose, they're quite unendurable." "Yes, but you don't know yet how my fellows can lay them on," said the captain menacingly, rising to his feet, and his face assumed an imperious and ferocious expression. that betrayed the unbridled violence of his character, only subdued for the time by sorrow. Here they first give a sound flogging, then sprinkle with vodka, and begin over again. Go along, finish your task. If you don't, you'll never get up again. If you do, 1,000 gold pieces. Oh, ho, ho, he's a rough one, thought the philosopher as he went out. He's not to be trifled with. Wait a moment, friend, I'll cut and run, so that you and your hounds will never catch me. And Koma made up his mind to run away. He only waited for the hour after dinner when all the servants were accustomed to lie about in the hay in the barns and to give vent to such snores and wheezing that the backyard sounded like a factory. The time came at last. Even Yevtuk closed his eyes as he lay stretched out in the sun. With fear and trembling, the philosopher stealthily made his way into the garden, from which he thought he could more easily escape into the open country without being observed. As is usual with such gardens, it was dreadfully neglected and overgrown, and so made an extremely suitable setting for any secret enterprise. Except for one little path trodden by the servants on their tasks, it was entirely hidden in a dense thicket of cherry trees, elders, and burdock, which thrust up their tall stems covered with clinging pinkish burrs. A network of wild hop was flung over this medley of trees and bushes of varied hues, forming a roof over them, clinging to the fence and falling, mingled with wild bellflowers, from it and coiling snakes. Beyond the fence which formed the boundary of the garden there came a perfect forest of tall grass and weeds, which looked as though no one cared to peep enviously into it, and as though any scythe would be broken to bits trying to mow down the stout stubbly stalks. When the philosopher tried to get over the fence, his teeth chattered and his heart beat so violently that he was frightened at it. The skirts of his long coat seemed to stick to the ground as though someone had nailed them down. As he climbed over, he fancied he heard a voice shout in his ears with a deafening hiss, "Where are you off to?" The philosopher dived into the long grass and started running, frequently stumbling over old roots and trampling upon moles. He saw that when he came out of the tall weeds, he would have to cross a field, and that beyond it lay a dark thicket of blackthorn in which he thought he would be safe. He expected after making his way through it to find the road leading straight to Kiev. He ran across the field at once and found himself in the thicket. He crawled through the prickly bushes, paying a toll of rags from his coat on every thorn, and came out into a little hollow. A willow with spreading branches bent down almost to the earth. A little brook sparkled pure as silver. The first thing the philosopher did was to lie down and drink, for he was insufferably thirsty. "Good water," he said, wiping his lips. "I might rest here." "No, we had better go straight ahead. They'll be coming to look for you." These words rang out above his ears. He looked around. Before him was standing Yevtuk. "Curse Yevtuk," the philosopher thought in his wrath. "I could take you and fling you, and I could batter in your ugly face and all of you with an oak post. You needn't have gone such a long way around," Yevtuk went on. "You'd have done better to keep to the road I have come by, straight by the stable. And it's a pity about your coat. It's a good cloth. What did you pay a yard for it? But we've walked far enough. It's time to go home." The philosopher trudged after Yevtuk, scratching himself. "Now the cursed witch will give it to me," he thought. "Though, after all, what am I thinking about? What am I afraid of? Am I not a Cossack? Why, I've been through 2 nights. God will help me with the third also. The cursed witch committed a fine lot of sins, it seems, since the evil one makes such a fight for her." Such were the reflections that absorbed him as he walked into the courtyard. Keeping up his spirits with these thoughts, he asked Durosh, who through the patronage of the butler sometimes had access to the cellars, to pull out a keg of vodka, and the 2 friends sitting in the barn put away not much less than half a pailful, so that the philosopher, getting on his feet, shouted, "Musicians, I must have musicians," and without waiting for the latter, fell to dancing a jig in a clear space in the middle of the yard. He danced till it was time for the afternoon snack, and the servants stood around him in a circle, as is the custom on such occasions, and at last spat on the ground and walked away, saying, "Good gracious, how long the fellow keeps it up." At last the philosopher lay down to sleep on the spot, and a good dousing with cold water was needed to wake him up for supper. At supper he talked of what it meant to be a Cossack, and how he should not be afraid of anything in the world. "Time is up," said Yevtuk. "Let's go." "A splinter through your tongue, you damned hog," thought the philosopher, and getting to his feet he said, "Come along." On the way, the philosopher kept glancing from side to side and made faint attempts at conversation with his companions. But Yevtuk said nothing, and even Durosh was disinclined to talk. It was a hellish night. A whole pack of wolves was howling in the distance, and even the barking of the dogs had a dreadful sound. "I imagine something else is howling," That's not a wolf, said Darush. Yavtuk was silent. The philosopher could find nothing to say. They drew near the church and stepped under the decaying wooden domes that showed how little the owner of the place thought about God and his own soul. Yavtuk and Darush withdrew as before, and the philosopher was left alone. I won't be afraid, by God, I will not. Everything was the same, everything wore the same sinister, familiar aspect. He stood still for a minute. The horrible witch's coffin was still standing motionless in the middle of the church. Drawing a circle around himself as before, he began recalling all his spells and exorcisms. There was an awful stillness. The candles spluttered and flooded the whole church with light. The philosopher turned one page, then turned another, and noticed that he was not reading what was written in the book. With horror, he crossed himself and began chanting. This gave him a little more courage. The reading made progress, and the pages turned rapidly one after the other. All of a sudden, in the midst of the stillness, the iron lid of the coffin burst with a crash, and the corpse rose up. It was more terrible than the first time. Its teeth clacked horribly against each other. Its lips twitched convulsively, and the incantations came from them in wild shrieks. A whirlwind swept through the church. The icons fell to the ground. Broken glass came flying down from the windows. The doors were burst from their hinges, and a countless multitude of monstrous beings flew into the church of God. A terrible noise of wings and scratching claws filled the church. All flew and raced about looking for the philosopher. All trace of drink had disappeared, and Koma's head was quite clear now. He kept crossing himself and repeating prayers at random, and all the while he heard evil creatures whirring around him, almost touching him with their loathsome tails and the tips of their wings. He had not the courage to look at them. He only saw a huge monster, the whole width of the wall, standing in the shade of its matted locks as of a forest. Through the tangle of hair, two eyes glared horribly with eyebrows slightly lifted. Above it, something was hanging in the air like an immense bubble, and 1,000 claws and scorpion stings stretching from the center. Black earth hung in clods on them. They were all looking at him, seeking him, but could not see him, surrounded by his charmed circle. "Bring V! Fetch V!" he heard the corpse cry. And suddenly a stillness fell upon the church. The wolves' howling was heard in the distance, and soon there was the thud of heavy footsteps resounding through the church. With a sidelong glance, he saw they were bringing a squat, thick-set, bandy-legged figure. He was covered all over with black earth. His arms and legs grew out like strong, sinewy roots. He trod heavily, stumbling at every step. His long eyelids hung down to the very ground. Koma saw with horror that his face was of iron. He was supported under the arms and led straight to the spot where Koma was standing. "Lift up my eyelids. I do not see," said V in a voice that seemed to come from deep in the earth. And all the creatures flew to raise his eyelids. "Do not look," an inner voice whispered to the philosopher. He could not restrain himself, and he looked. "There he is," shouted V and thrust an iron finger at him, and all pounced upon the philosopher together. He fell expiring to the ground, and his soul fled from his body in terror. There was the sound of a cock crowing. It was the second cock crow. The first had been missed by the gnomes. In panic, they rushed to the doors. They rushed to the doors and windows to fly out. But they could not, and so they remained there, stuck in the doors and windows. When the priest went in, he stopped short at the sight of this defamation of God's holy place and dared not serve the requiem on such a spot. And so the church was left forever, with monsters stuck in the doors and windows, overgrown with forest trees, roots, rough grass, and wild thorns, and no one can now find the way to it. When the rumors of this reached Kiev and the theologian Kaliava heard at last of the fate of the philosopher Koma, he spent a whole hour plunged in thought. Great changes had befallen him during that time. Fortune had smiled on him. On the conclusion of his course of study, he was made bell ringer of the very highest belfry, and he was almost always to be seen with a damaged nose, as the wooden staircase to the belfry had been extremely carelessly made. "Have you heard what has happened to Koma?" Tiberi Gurubets, who by now was a philosopher and had a newly grown mustache, asked, coming up to him. "Such was the lot God sent him," said Kaliava, the bell ringer. "Let us go to the tavern and drink to his memory." The young philosopher, who was beginning to enjoy his privileges with the ardor of an enthusiast, so that his full trousers and his coat, and even his cap reeked of spirits and coarse tobacco, instantly signified his readiness. "He was a fine fellow, Koma," said the bell ringer, as the lame tavern keeper placed the third mug before him. "He was a fine man, and he came to grief for nothing." "I know why he came to grief. It was because he was afraid. If he had not been afraid, the witch could not have done anything to him. You have only to cross yourself and spit right on her tail and nothing will happen. I know all about it. Why, the old women who sit in our market in Kiev are all witches." To this the bell ringer bowed his head in token of agreement. But observing that his tongue was incapable of uttering a single word, he cautiously got up from the table and, lurching to right and to left, went to hide in a remote spot in the rough grass. From the force of habit, however, he did not forget to carry off the sole of an old boot that was lying on the bench.